Good afternoon, everybody. So just to remind members of the committee that our role is twofold. It's an opinion on your financial statements.
Could I just ask you to bring your microphone just closer towards you?
Does that work, Chair? Is that clear?
That's better.
Yep. So just to remind members of the committee, as your external auditors, our role is twofold. Firstly, it's an opinion on your financial statements, and secondly, it's the value for money conclusion. External audit is a retrospective exercise, so it's done predominantly after the year end. So now we're dealing with last year, 21-22. The documents you have in front of you at item 7, and there are two. The first is the plan that I'll talk to briefly shortly, that sets out our approach to discharging our responsibilities in each of those two areas. I'll pause at the end of presenting that, and then I will then, with your permission, Chair, move on to the second sub-item, which is called the Informing the Audit Risk Assessment, that I think starts on page 61 of your papers. So, given your introduction, Chair, I will take the report as read, but I'd just like to highlight a few key elements to the plan. So if I could refer members of the committee to page 38 of your papers, that is headed up Introduction and Headlines. You'll see halfway down on the right-hand side that I refer to materiality. So shortly I will talk about the timeline for reporting for this year, but when I do come to sign your accounts for 21-22, hopefully ahead of the end of November deadline, I won't be signing those off to say they're correct to the penny. We work to what we call a materiality figure, and you'll see that at the planning stage, we are proposing a materiality figure of just over 7.8 million. And what that means really is that any item of accounts in any of the primary statements within your accounts will be subject to additional audit procedures. Clearly, one of the first things we do is when we get the draft accounts is reconcile all the accounts and all the entries back to your trial balance, your general ledger, but we will focus on the bigger numbers within your financial statements, and any figure over 7.8 million will be subject to some detailed testing. There are some particular areas of the accounts that get even more of our attention, and those tend to be the areas that are subject to greatest estimation and judgment. And you will see above the materiality heading, we refer to significant risks. So the first of those is management override and control, and this is a default audit risk at all entities, irrespective of their nature. And this is, as I said, areas where you are making judgment and estimation. But it also involves quite a lot of work around journals. Journals is a very effective way of moving monies between account codes and expenditure codes, or dare I say financial years, if you wish to do so, and a lot of work will go on the journals. One of your key primary statements in your draft accounts is your balance sheet. And at the top of your balance sheet, Herefordshire Council has a very large asset base, land, building and investment properties. You employ your own external valuer to value those assets. And for this year, we are proposing to introduce an additional level of challenge from our side. We will be, for the first time, employing our own valuation experts that will review the work of your expert to gain assurance over land, buildings and investment properties. Just as you have a very large assets at the top of your balance sheet, you have a similarly large deficit or liability at the bottom of your balance sheet in the form of the pension fund net liability. Once again, this is subject to a large degree of estimation and judgment, predominantly from the actuary. And once again, there's a lot of work that we do using our own experts to gain assurance over that figure. And those will be the main areas where we will be undertaking additional audit procedures. That's the approach in a nutshell for the opinion. You'll see at the bottom of page 38 on the right-hand side, we reference the value for money conclusion and the value for money arrangements. Members of the committee will be aware from the previous meeting of this committee that a lot of work went in last year to assessing your arrangements, and some significant weaknesses were identified in a number of areas. And what I sought to do on page 38 is draw out the main risks potentially for 21-22, and as a result, the areas that we will be focusing on again. So you'll see that we've referenced the failure to meet the statutory needs of children in care. given some of the recent ratings. Once again, we will be assessing progress in that area. And in light of the comments we made in last year's report around contract management and contract appointment, you'll see we've got two areas that we're going to be focusing on again. Whether you are improving the arrangements that you have in place for managing contracts, and also the arrangements that you have in place for contract appointment, particularly given the observations we made about the relationship that the council has with the dormant company. And the final bullet point, which I consider to be an all-encapsulating one, is the reference to the ability of the council to learn from previous failings and ensure corrective action is put in place to ensure no repetition of those concerns in future years. And what we will be looking to do is work with officers and understand how each of these areas are being progressed and continue to be progressed, but particularly what has happened and what has taken place in 21 and 22. Chair, the only other probably areas that I wanted to bring out in this report are on page 54 of your papers. So I am conscious that our planning work is complete. We're actually working on Herefordshire Council at the moment and tidying up the remaining elements of our planning. We are due to receive the draft financial statements for 21-22 from officers on Friday, which will be some 2 months ahead of the deadline that has been extended to the 31st of August this year. The fact that we are able to receive them on the 1st of July enables us to make an early start. So we have approximately 42 local government audits across the southwest, and only a small number of those will be starting in July because we've had to stagger them, given the work that goes into an individual audit. Herefordshire has been prioritised and will be one of our early starts. And you will see at the timeline at the top of page 54 that we are hoping to complete the work by the end of August, which will enable us to conclude our opinion work well in advance of the November deadline. The final observation and something that I wanted to draw out was the proposed fee for discharging our role for 21-22. The information is set out in summary on page 55 and in more detail on page 56. So my contract or our contract is with public sector auditors appointments to undertake the audits of Herefordshire County Council, Herefordshire Council. And when that contract was entered into, a scale fee was established. You will be aware, based on the discussions at the previous meeting, that additional fees have been incurred in previous years, as is the case at other councils. That continues to be the case and reflects the additional audit procedures that we need to undertake to discharge our responsibilities. A key element of that here at Herefordshire is the additional work that we will be doing around the VFM conclusion that's increased significantly. And in light of some of the observations that were made by the leadership team about progress in the last 12 months, we will be spending more time again this year understanding the progress that's been made by the council in relation to value for money, and we will be using Jeanette as our local advisory expert to undertake that work again. So, Chair, I'm probably going to stop there, but I'm happy to take any questions on the plan.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, well, I've got a few myself to start the ball rolling, I suppose. The external audit fee at 179,667. I know it's been discussed with our Director of Resources and Assurance, otherwise known as our 151 officer, Andrew Lovegrove. And as he hasn't commented, I'm presuming that he's content with that as a fee. Are you content that it's enough? And I reflect now upon news that accounting and audit bodies are awarding salary increase of 9%. So, and you don't seem, it doesn't seem to be a significant increase on last year's fees. I just wondered if we're really reflecting costs or whether we're going to see some efficiencies being made in delivering the work that you intend to carry out for us. So I'll just let you think about that for a moment. And the other question relating to that really is the payment of the additional £40,000 for the value for money audit, which is an estimated fee. I'm just wondering how I explain that to the average citizen of Herefordshire and what it delivers for my elderly neighbour. And I just wondered if you could comment on that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm more than happy to comment on those two questions. So if I take the overall fee first, I suppose, you know, in terms of the fee is driven by the contract that was let 4 years ago with public sector audit appointments. Public sector audit appointments have the ability to adjust fees to reflect the quantum of work required to discharge the auditor's role. And that is why across the board, fees have gone up significantly because the role of the auditor has become more involved. It takes longer. We need more people to do the work with the right skills. It also has an impact on you as a council because your finance staff are now having more of their time committed to producing more complex accounts and answering more detailed questions of the auditors. So it is a much more involved process for both parties. So we are required under the contract to deliver that. And clearly what we do is we seek to recover our costs within the framework in which we operate. You're absolutely right. There is a recognition that there is a shortage of skilled auditors available to enable us to discharge our responsibilities, as is the case with other firms. We are constantly trying to recruit more people because we've got more work than we have people. And, you know, I suspect that when the contract is renegotiated in the next 12 months with PSAA, that there will be some pretty sizable increases in the baseline fees going forward. Nonetheless, what we have done for this year is we proposed a fee based on the information known to us at this point in time. So you're absolutely right, and I'll refer to your second question on the £40,000 value for money. So I think it's probably helpful to have a discussion about the value for money role as auditors. So the auditors of any normal business that you would, you know, a company down the road making widgets, the role of the auditor in the private sector is purely one of concluding whether the accounts present a true and fair position and a position of the financial strength of that organisation at year end. It makes no comment about how that position was arrived at and the money spent and the money incurred. Interestingly, in the public sector, there is an additional responsibility placed on the auditor in the public sector, and that is to give a value for money conclusion. The value for money conclusion, value for money means lots of things to lots of people. But for us as auditors, it's all to do with what the NAO set out in their guidance as to what value for money entails. And you will be aware that it changed last year. So the NAO every 5 years are required to revisit what value for money means and what the auditors are required to look at. They consulted a couple of years ago, and the observation was that actually, does the value for money work from the auditors add value? It's not telling us enough, it's too high level. So they've revisited it and they've come up with a much more involved and detailed process, which we applied for the first time last year. It's much more detailed, but importantly, it only focuses on 3 areas. Financial sustainability, because clearly austerity, you know, your income sources. Many years ago, you had revenue support grant. That's disappeared over the horizon. You're more heavily reliant on council tax and business rates, but also in generating additional sources of income to give you that capacity to deliver the ever-increasing needs of your public. And it really is ever-increasing. They've got ever-increasing expectations. You've had austerity, and it becomes increasingly more difficult every year to balance the books and maintain service delivery, or dare I say, improve it. So financial sustainability is an interest for us, and we will be looking at that. The second area, which is particularly relevant to this committee, is governance. How do you govern your arrangements? Last year, we concluded that we didn't think you had effective arrangements in place. So the areas that I said we would focus on about governance, about decision-making, informed decision-making, making decisions based on complete and accurate information, proper business cases, monitoring and reporting and assessing how things are being delivered, learning from things that go wrong. All those sorts of things are really important. Risk management, internal control. We spend a lot of time looking at that. And then the third area is the 3 E's: economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. How do you know how well you're delivering your services? What information do decision makers, cabinet receive to understand how the council is performing? Do they set targets? Do they monitor against them? Do they compare themselves to against their peers? How do they decide if they're spending the right amount and it's being delivered economically and effectively? And that's the third area of focus. And that also was deemed to be an area where there were significant weaknesses in the council last year, as reported to the previous meeting of this committee. So I've probably gone on a bit too long there, Chair, but that's the VFM in a nutshell.
I think you provided a very comprehensive answer. Whether I can remember it and whether it'll mean something to my next door neighbour, I'm not sure, but I think it's yes, we've covered all those areas that make up the value for money. And if I can state again that this committee looks forward to receiving some training on the value for money changes that we've been promised for about over a year. I'll just make that point at this stage as well. Any other committee members with questions on the external audit? Councillor Ginman.
Yes, just following on from your statement there, I think one of the concerns that has been expressed is that we tend to read in here of things that sound as though it was last year, but they are historic. So the issues that have been highlighted were ones that were highlighted by external bodies, and your colleague explained at the last meeting that you have duty bound, therefore, to write in here. This is not something that you found with regard to childcare. Yep. It was external bodies, but you have to report it, and one accepts that. But it also points out that that's one example where the cases go back to 2011, 2014. We've similarly got other items that are in here that are historic. And I think trying to understand the nature of what is currently of concern or historically in the last year is a concern, because each report, it refers to its own year. I would like to think that we can then look at it and say, have improved or haven't improved. Otherwise, there's a tendency to read this and you think, well, nothing's moved, nothing's changed, because you're reporting things that are not actually pertinent to the year in which the audit report is based. Can I also pick up on another item, which is page 41, significant risks identified? This is obviously standard procedure, but I'm grateful if you could just explain. You say significant risks identified, and then say that because they've been rebutted, they are not deemed significant risks. And yet the two items there would in their own right in societal terms be viewed as significant risks. So clearly is here something that is a process which I'm ignorant of. Please fill the gap and explain why you are confident that there is no fraud in revenue or no fraud in expenditure, and that you don't, in effect, look for that as I read it.
Through you, Chair, if I may. Yep. So I'll take the first point with regard to timing. I think there is a recognition that for the first year of the new VFM requirements, our reporting was not as timely as we would have liked to have been. So I'm conscious that the last meeting of this committee was in April or was it in May? But we were reporting a couple of months ago on the arrangements in relation to 2021. It was the first year of the new value for money arrangements, the more detailed approach, and it took us longer because we didn't have a baseline to understand where you were. Now that has ramifications, because I've no doubt, for example, with children's services, you would have been aware of the weaknesses already. And as you said, what we have a responsibility to do is make our own judgments, but also have regard to others that come in and externally review you, and that's what we did. But actually, our aspiration would be that we would be reporting the 21-22 VFM work a lot earlier than we did. So we would be aiming, and I've spoken to Jeanette about this, we've already got a meeting in the diary to discuss this. We would absolutely be hoping to complete the value for money work in this calendar year and possibly earlier. So you'll have a much more timely piece of work this year. We absolutely have to comment on the arrangements for 21-22, but we will also comment and make observations about the current position, recognising that clearly the overall judgment needs to be in relation to the year in question. So that's the first question. So that's on VFM. Your second point on page 41 is back to the opinion and the financial statements. So just as I said, management override control in my introduction is a risk that we have to have regard to at all audits. These are the other two, revenue and expenditure and fraud in each of those areas. It's very unusual to rebut them in audit world, but the public sector is probably one of the few areas where we can do that, because if we think about your income, and we talked about it earlier, your income is from very well-defined controlled sources. So it comes from your collection fund, council tax and business rates. That's the large majority of it. Yes, it used to come and heavily be reliant on central government grants. You still get those, and you had those for the last 2 years in relation to COVID. You get some of your income from other sources, and your own generated income, but the large majority of your income comes from very well controlled and defined sources. So we can rebut the fraud risk because inherently it's a lower risk. And that's not to suggest that we aren't doing lots of testing on your income. We will be crawling all over your income to make sure it's properly stated, but we won't be going into quite the same degree as we would perhaps if we were auditing some private sector company down the road that needs to generate a certain amount of income and demonstrate increased sales to improve its share price, or get a loan from the bank to reinvest or to pay performance-related pay. So, things when you get performance-related pay in an area, it increases the inherent risk of manipulation. A lot of that doesn't apply within the public sector. And that equally applies to the expenditure area as well. Rest assured, we will be looking in all areas of key expenditure again in 21-22.
Thank you. That's very. Thank you. That's very helpful to understand that basis. If I may, I'll just pick up one other point that I was pleased to hear you say about valuation of property and bringing your own expert. Can I ask, do you also bring in, because one of the areas you touch on is IT system security, and how much are you reliant on what you're told, and how much do you bring somebody else in to actually test that process as well? And when you're dealing with the evaluation of property, do you actually look at dilapidations at the same time so that you would comment upon the state of any property portfolio that's held as to whether reasonable due care with regard to its maintenance has occurred?
Through you, Chair, if I may. So the IT, once again, we do use our auditors experts to come in and look at your IT arrangements. It's fair to say that we do that at a what I call a moderate level, because what we've deemed to be the most effective approach to discharging our responsibilities is a substantive approach. So we are not adopting a controls-based audit. So we're not looking at how you process payroll, how you progress, and looking at the controls and then reducing our testing at year end. We wait for the accounts to arrive and we actually drill down into the detail within the numbers and test the numbers to make sure it's appropriately categorized and recorded. So we do IT work and we do bring experts in to do it, but actually we do a substantive audit approach. And if we find issues, we extend our sample size. In terms of the property and the assets, so in terms of our own expert, they will come in and they will review this year how you as a council have instructed your valuer to arrive at the valuation of all your assets. You don't evaluate all your assets every year, so there's a requirement to do it on a rolling programme, but there's also a requirement to do it in sufficient frequency to make sure there's not a risk of material misstatement. And you talk about dilapidation. So one of the key things that we would expect your officers to be doing when they instruct your valuer is to say, in arriving at that valuation for that building or that piece of land that you own, not so much the land, but the building, have you considered the state of it? Have you considered the need to impair it? And that impairment might be for a lot of reasons. It might be burnt down. It might be just that you've got a massive backlog in maintenance. It may well be that you've declared a climate emergency and actually the boilers that are in there, you've made a commitment to get rid of them and replace them with heat pumps, and therefore really all that the valuation that's held within the fact that the boiler should be removed, because actually you're going to have to replace them very soon. So this is becoming an increasingly area of focus, because impairment now with things like the climate emergency may suggest that the longevity of some of the elements within your land and buildings may not have as long a lifespan as they may have done before you've done that. So that is an area that we're particularly interested in, and we will be focusing more on. And this is just indicative of why it takes longer, because we're asking lots more searching questions, and officers are increasingly having to spend more time responding.
Thank you very much. That last point was one that was at the back of my mind, particularly with regard to how EPCs and everything else are all moving and the requirements for our property. So thank you.
Thank you. I know I've got Councillor Bolson with a question. I just wanted to cover the, I had impairment down myself as a query. I think in terms of the valuation of land and buildings and investment properties on page 42, I didn't see impairment as a line item, whereas I did see it somewhere else, I think, on impairment of infrastructure costs. So I was going to raise the issue of why is there not impairment on the land and buildings. You explained that yes, there is anyway, if it's just not written down. I'm also interested, therefore, I believe that the council will have probably a question for Andrew. Do we have an impairment reserve? Because we don't, because it's not a liquid fund item, but we do move items in and out of impairment as we purchase buildings or sell buildings or revalue them on a different basis. And I'm just wondering if there is an impairment reserve, whether the external audit can include taking a look at that and how it relates to our financial figures, as figures will be coming out, I think the draft figures in July before us. And it's always it's an area I get a little bit confused about, the devaluation reserve and the impairment reserve. And none of it's real money, but it affects the capital valuation and the values that we hold. You're nodding. Do we have an impairment reserve?
Well, no, we don't have an impairment reserve for these. We have capital financial reserve, a whole raft of other reserves that you've mentioned on there. And part of the impairment review is it a permanent impairment? Is it a temporary impairment? So, for example, we have a number of commercial properties we rent out. The rules have changed about the energy efficiency rating of these and what you can and can't rent to the market. So we've had over the years some properties that didn't meet a certain threshold, so we've gone away and improved them to meet them. So technically at that point they were impaired, but it was a temporary one because we had a planning programme to make sure that those properties were that energy efficiency was improved, so they got the higher rating, so that we're able to market them. But no, we don't have an impairment reserve as such on that. But it is part of the instruction to the external valuers to consider that when they're valuing our assets. So that, and then we will take a view whether we need to create or recognise there is an impairment. And that's part of the process we follow.
Thank you. Excuse me then for my ignorance. Councillor Bolson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I've just got a couple of questions. My first one was following on from Peter Dimmon's point on, I think, page 41, and the presumed risk of fraud in expenditure recognition. Noting that you're referring to Torridge District Council in this quite a few times in this section, but and I'm really looking forward. I know we've got value for money training in our action log, so I'm looking forward to getting hopefully that training before we see the next set of accounts. So excuse me if my question is not particularly well rounded, but presumed risk of fraud and expenditure recognition, you go on to say that you've rebutted this risk because expenditure is well controlled and has a strong control environment. Yet in our value for money statement, you're saying that governance around particular areas, you've raised that as an issue. So I just wanted to understand how that value for money statement doesn't impact this presumed risk over the expenditure recognition.
Through you, Chair. And firstly, apologies for the reference to Torrance. That is a mistake and it should be Herefordshire. So in response to your second question in relation to the expenditure recognition, this is about whether expenditure that is incurred by the council is correctly recorded in the financial statements, and it is well. So the ability for you to spend money and accurately record it in your accounts is well controlled. The value for money is about whether that expenditure is delivering value for money when you've incurred it. So the criticism that's been levied at you last year as a council is in relation to the use you are making of that money to deliver against your aspirations as a council and the needs of your stakeholders and the general public.
Okay, that's a little bit more helpful. And also, I think on page 42, management override of controls, I think around journaling. I think historically we've always had an issue come up about, I think, some control weaknesses in our systems around journaling. And I think you just have to raise it each year. Is that going to be the case again this year, or have we agreed?
Well, through you, Chair, we haven't made any fundamental changes, so it'll be part of the audit process that people reflect. So
they won't change, they won't accept it and look at the different ways that you're controlling it. It will still come up as an issue again.
I think that Grant wanted to make a very valid observation, and it's a choice about how we operate and manage things. If we had an army of accountants, I would probably do things differently, but the reality with the resource we've got allocated, I'm comfortable with the way that we do things, and I think Grant thought I've just bringing to your attention there are different ways that we don't. It's a judgment call about how we deploy the resources.
Same again this year. Okay. And then my last question, please, for clarity, just to help with my understanding, is on page 40. When we look at Herefordshire Council and Cooper Limited, and you talk about individual significance and then the level of response required and the ISA 600. So I just wanted to understand with Hooper, another one of our actions is getting a greater understanding of the governance arrangements over Hooper, and whether as an Audit and Governance Committee we need to have greater view over people. So I just wanted to better understand what individual significance is and why Hoopers know, and then get a better understanding of the analytical procedures at group level and what that means, please.
Through you, Chair. So if I can just perhaps come back and respond to Andrew's point about journals. So the journal issue is one that we come across at a number of councils, which is the arrangements for authorising journals. Somebody will have permission to post a journal, and best practice suggests that that is subject to an independent authorisation process. It can be quite involved and time consuming given the number of journals that are done, particularly year end. So lots of councils will introduce thresholds above which a journal needs to be independently authorised. Some will do random samples, etc., to get around that. We will always recommend that there needs to be an authorisation process in place, and you're absolutely right, we've raised it in previous years. What I would say is what we have done in previous years is we've selected using a bit of software where we download all the journals you make in year at year end, and we risk assess them, and we drill down and we pick a sample and we test them. And when we've done that historically here, we've concluded that the journals are appropriate. And so we deem them to be appropriate to the circumstances, but we will continue to raise that recommendation whilst the authorisation process isn't in place. In terms of your second point with regard to Hoople, so you produce group accounts. given the size of people. But what we need to do is when we audit the entity, Herefordshire, we are also required to audit the group that consolidates Hoople. And in doing so, we have different approaches dependent on how big an impact the subsidiary has on the single entity. And because of
financial impact.
Absolutely, as opposed to whether it's delivering against the reason why it was established as an alternative service delivery model in the first place, which is clearly, as you say, of interest to you. So we are looking at it purely from a financial point of view. What impact does Hoople have on the overall council in terms of its financial spend, income, and the balance sheet year end? And given the relative size of the two entities, the appropriate approach, because it's not huge, is analytical review. If it was much bigger, and there are lots of councils with much bigger entities that have a major impact on it and have absolutely material large volumes of assets and liabilities and loans and transactions, we would adopt a more involved process. But here at Herefordshire, we're content to do what we call analytical review, but it doesn't, but also all of our sampling would involve the population that includes Hoople. So we're always picking a sample from not just the council, but Hoople as well. In terms of your observation about gaining an understanding how Hoople is controlled and whether it's delivering against what it was set up to do, that is more to do with the BFM again in governance and how you're working with partnership and how you're working, with alternative service delivery models to deliver and facilitate delivery of services. And we will be interested in that as well.
Thank you, Councillor Balderson. I think that I'm reflecting on what you both said then, a comment on Hoople within the value for money statement would be one that the Audit and Governance Committee would be interested in seeing. Just a wider question. I note Appendix B, as delivered this year, is quite more extensive and comprehensive than the first appearance of Appendix B last year. And although Audit and Governance, we welcome more information. Both the Appendix A and the Appendix B are marked commercial and confidence. And I was just going to question why that is, because I'm conscious, I'm not conscious of any reason why they should be necessarily commercial competence, apart from the fact that Appendix B might at times refer to particular persons or companies with which you have identified an issue which you're taking forward. For that reason, there is a redaction in Appendix B as published, but I'm still struggling with why we're labeling it commercial competence and then publishing it in the public arena. So either it shouldn't be commercial competence, and we accept that, or it should be, and therefore it should be preserved as commercial competence. I'm just asking the question as to why it's labelled as such, because presumably it's Thornton's labelled it.
So we do label all our reports commercial in confidence, recognising that they will find their way invariably into the public domain. So with all our local government bodies, all our documents come through those charged with governance, which is invariably a version of an audit committee that are made publicly available. So we fully recognise that these are all fully available to the public. Commercial in confidence is the default approach, and I can go away, Chair, and find out, but that's the reason why it's in there, is because that's what we've been asked to do by our centre. But as you say, it's our expression in confidence, but it doesn't mean it cannot be shared and accessed by the wider public.
Yeah, I mean, I could see, therefore, confidential. I'm not quite sure why the word commercial. Commercial confidence to me means that it contains information that can be a commercial advantage to someone who should not be able to sit I don't want to take up time talking about semantics, but it just, sometimes you sort of eyes gloss over these things and you think, why is this there?
I don't think there's anything untoward there in terms of any concern specifically. It is, all I would say is this is absolutely how we label all our reports to all our audits within the public sector.
And I'm presuming that because these papers are published before we take a view on them in public committee, that within Herefordshire Council, the paper is reviewed and publication is agreed by a senior officer. Andrew, is that the case? Yes. So in this instance, it would be yourself that said, yes, I'm content for this to be published. Thank you. So I'll just clarifying where that decision's made. Okay. Thank you. Any further questions on external audit? Right, Peter, you're looking like like we haven't asked you a question that you're expecting or something of that type, but carry on.
Yeah, all I was going to say is if we've not got any further questions on the plan, are you happy for me to go and briefly present the second report, which is the informing the audit risk assessment that starts on page 61 of your papers, which is also item 7.
By all means, yes.
Thank you. So for the more long-standing members of this committee, this will be familiar to you. So this is it's a report based on Grant Thornton, on the Grant Thornton template that is a series of questions that we are required to ask of management every year. So it covers areas like fraud, legality, laws and regulations, going concern, estimates. It is a standard template that we ask management to complete. The version you have in front of you is the complete version with management responses to each of the questions. We have looked at it. It is consistent with our understanding of Herefordshire. But what we do for completeness and what is deemed to be best practice is that this report then in turn comes to you as those charged with governance to indicate whether you concur generally with what management have said and whether there is anything else in any of these areas that you would like to bring to my attention as the appointed auditor that I may well want to consider when undertaking the audit that starts next week.
Thank you. Committee. Points. Councillor Ginman.
Just one comment on this. There's quite a few occasions you'll have noted, even in the meeting today, where it said external consultants are being appointed, external people are being appointed to undertake work. I noted when I was looking through here that there were some that were listed and some were not, and I wasn't sure quite when you, I think it's page 68 in here, you've got, can you provide detail to other advisors consulted during the year? And I just wondered how that list was compiled, or was that very specific to one area, or what, when we constantly have other people coming in, is there another list somewhere of all of those people and the reasons why they're used, or the monies and expenditure that's used for them? I just wondered how that was managed and audited. So I was thinking that some of the management of Maylord Orchards, for example, has been, the company's been involved with that. They don't appear necessarily in there. Is that because they're not deemed part of that type of consideration?
Andrew, if you want to come back.
No, this list was prepared by officers, so it's prepared by people that work for the council. And I guess part of that is what we mean by the word advisors. So this is where we're employing people to manage things on our behalf. So Maylord, we wouldn't see those as advisors. They're people we're employed to manage things on our behalf. So we have agents who manage a number of our property transactions are dealing with tenants and those type of things. These are where we have paid somebody to give us advice, if that makes sense. So a distinction between paying for a service to do things on our behalf, whereas the ones here have specific advice around certain defined areas.
So do those other people then come under another category that's in here and they get covered in that process?
Well, I don't think we were asked to provide those. We certainly have a list of people we employ to a third party was used to manage things on our behalf. So, but I guess we'd have to think through how we define that list. So Bound for Beating manage our road network on our behalf. So where you draw the line in terms of those arrangements. But I think that we answered it in the spirit of these people, organisers that we're paying to advise us, to provide specific advice.
Peter.
Thank you, Chair. So this document here is in relation to the opinion on the financial statement. So it is about advisors that you would have used on an ongoing basis or on a one-off basis to inform a type of accounting treatment, or a certain way of reporting or valuing something, or it's things that would potentially where you've gone out and you've decided that you don't have the expertise internally, and you've gone out to get some advice about a changing accounting policy, something new that may appear in the accounts and may impact on the numbers specifically, if that makes sense. Because this is all to do with the financial elements of the council and what appears in your accounts.
Yeah, thank you. That I can understand that basis, but I was thinking in terms of the value for money, which you drawn to our attention as particular areas of concern, and therefore, how is that then accounted for in terms of those sorts of people who are consulted, looked at, advised, advisors? How does that get picked up in this process?
So that would be value for money, and value for money is based on, so our approach to value for money is, and clearly we've got the baseline from last year and the areas of focus that I've outlined earlier, but the value for money work is based on our cumulative knowledge of the council from doing the accounts, but also document reviews. So there is a suite of documents that we will seek from officers, your corporate strategy, all the way down to individual policies, business cases, expenditure on consultants, amongst other things. We'll be able to see them from when we start doing the accounts. We won't look at all of them, but we will, because we need to focus on the areas of greatest risk. But we will look at documents to review, lots of which are available on the website, lots of them we will have to ask for, and then we supplement them with specific interviews with key personnel within the council, whether that be the leadership team, whether it be the monitoring officer, whether it be councillors as well, which we would want to do again this year to understand their perceptions and views on how well value for money is or is not being delivered. And that will inform our further inquiries.
Thank you. That's helpful. And you've made the point at the outset, the number of councils that you undertake the same tasks for. Do you draw from that any information of a comparative nature that would say, well, as a council, you seem to be using less than, more than, equal to, in terms of external or other advisors?
We don't, because it's proved notoriously difficult to compare apples with apples. That's not to say we are not trying, and now that we've done 1 year of the new approach, to try and share best practice, and where we are seeing, and we're looking for best practice as well. So one of the things I will say when I go to any interview with anybody as part of the value for money approach this year is, we're not trying to catch you out. If there's something you think that the council is doing really well, tell us about it, because we want to hear about it, and we will seek to reflect that in the report because we want it to be balanced. And similarly, if there are issues or weaknesses, we will try and identify where there may be scope for learning elsewhere. Every council is different, but there's lots of similarities as well. And it may well be that there is benefit in speaking to other councils about how they have perhaps undertaken a particular thing or learned from mistakes and those sorts of things. So we are trying to do that, but I think it's something we're looking to develop as the new approach is embedded.
Perhaps we should be looking at Torridge.
Just one last point on we talk a little bit about, or I picked up a common thread about accounting estimates and a question that you were putting, that the Audit and Governance Committee were fully au fait and conversant with and content with accounting estimates and accounting estimates controls as used by the council. And that caused me a little bit of concern, because I don't think accounting estimates, unless I'm misunderstanding the term, is something that this committee has spent a lot of time discussing, reviewing, and taking papers on. And I'm just perhaps then going to go to our 151 officer and say, is accounting estimates and our responsibility for fully appreciating them something new? Is it something old that we seem to have overlooked in our review of responsibilities? Because I don't think it occurs as a bullet point in our constitution for the audit and governance responsibility. And yet the external auditors report makes a great deal of reference to them. We all seem to be, it's either me not understanding or we seem to be a bit awash with where we should be on accounting estimates. But accounting estimates may be something so small and trivial and specific for Heritage Council that they don't warrant a great deal of activity. But some comment perhaps from my officer.
Thank you, Chair. 20 years ago, local government had 9 months to produce their accounts or whatever. So accounting really didn't matter because by the time we did the accounts, things had sorted themselves out. Either you'd settled the bill or people had paid. So slightly tongue in cheek, but that's how a lot of the estimates were dealt with because they just waited long enough till it was resolved one way or another. But things have moved on since then, and the desire to get information out quicker and more promptly to people, to our residents, is overrunning it. So more emphasis placed on estimates. Councils are a large, complex group of services. You all know that, sitting on various scrutiny committees, setting the budget. So a number of those areas, we don't have the exact financial information when we close the accounts. Either we don't know whether somebody's going to pay the bill or we haven't finally settled the last bit of the bill with the supplier. So we use a series of estimates to work out the most appropriate number to use in the accounts. And as Pete said, it isn't balanced into the penny because we just have so many volume of transactions going through. We have to use estimating techniques. So nothing's changed from this year. Last year, the big change was in 2004, 2005 when the council started to change their process of new estimates. So it's part of what we do in terms of the finance function. It's kind of what you see when you set the budget. All of those are estimates going through and producing the quarterly reports that go to Cabinet, the outturn and the year-end. Some of those include estimates where we've made an educated, informed judgment about what the number should be. But the one thing we can't do is wait until that is finally settled, because that's too long.
I was going to pass over to Peter. Yes, if you can be more specific on what the legislation or what you as the external auditor anticipate the Audit and Governance Committee are doing in terms of estimates.
So, I mean, just to add to Andrew's observations, the main driver for the inclusion of more detail around estimates on our papers to this committee is as a result of a change in ISA 540, International Standards on Auditing 540, which changed 2 years ago, which really beefed up. So that's all about estimates, and it really beefed up the responsibilities of the auditors to dig deeper into those aspects of the accounts that are based on estimates. Because I think, some of the corporate failures in the private sector, Carillion, etc., where it was found wanting was that invariably the errors in the accounts were in the estimates within the accounts. So, you'd have a scenario where, an asset is valued at 50 million when it was only worth 10 million, and, there's, things like shopping centres that some councils have purchased, out of region, and, what is the value of those? And it's difficult, and therefore it's important. There is a recognition that in terms of the challenge to the accounts, they come from us as the auditors, but also there is a responsibility on those charged with governance to understand how officers have produced their accounts and also challenge them as to whether what they've done is appropriate, as an extra level of checking. So by management articulating where they consider to be the main areas of estimation in the accounts, it enables and it encourages, hopefully, the committee to actually say, well, can I just understand a bit more? It will demonstrate to me that this is reasonable before I approve the accounts. I know the auditors will give it going over, but I would like to know, because I'm worried, you know, and clearly if you are a council that doesn't have lots of investment property, doesn't have a massive asset base, then it might be a bit different to if you're a small district council on the south coast that has got £1 billion worth of investment property that may fluctuate significantly between years depending on market conditions.
Thank you. That puts it in context. If there are no further questions, I'll move to the recommendations. I don't think we had any more recommendations brought forward.
No, Chair, I think the only thing I didn't quite close off was you mentioned about welcome and comment about related in the value statement, but I just wanted to clarify if you intend an action or recommendation on that. It's probably more a comment made in the meeting that I think unless the committee is minded otherwise, that I think Audit and Governance would be quite interested in any external audit comment on value for money relating statement to include any comment on people. If external audit felt it worthwhile to include people in the upcoming review. I'll leave it as open as that. So the recommendations A, B and C as written. A, that the proposed external audit plan 21-22 Appendix A is approved subject to any recommendations the committee may wish to make. B, committee note informing the audit risk assessment document attached to Appendix B. And C, the committee determining recommendations which is to make to maximise the value of combined internal and external audit processes. Are we content? Three. I've got a furry brown next to me, but anyone? Yeah. Okay. Show hands, folks, so that we've got that for the record. Thank you, and thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
May get back to the motorway or wherever you're off to. So if there's anyone want a 5-minute comfort break at this time, or get a cup of coffee or anything? No, we're all content, right? Okay. Now on. Agenda item 8, the update on internal audit recommendations. Purpose of this to review progress of audit recommendations and implementation. The committee receives periodic reports and progress made in implementing audit recommendations to enable it to fulfil its role of monitoring the effective governance and operation of risk management, corporate governance of the council. Now, I understand that Kevin Lloyd, the performance team lead, who would have been presenting this, is away all today, which is unfortunate. Do we have anybody else to speak on his behalf?
We don't have anybody online, as it were.
All right. That sort of stymies where we can go with quite a few questions on my sheet of paper, 2 sheets of paper anyway. I'm just wondering whether we spend the time raising some issues. Andrew may be able to comment on some of them, but I would have thought on all, or possibly even on many. But at least then we'll have some homework for Kevin and others to come back to, because there are, I think, as expressed to me by committee, some concerns on the delivery of some of these internal audit actions. Councillor Balderson.
If I'm right, we've got in our work programme for next month, or our next meeting, the statement of accounts, which, given the timeline that was just in the report, will not come in July. Is that correct? And if that is the case, will we have a gap and this potentially could be moved to the next meeting?
Chair, the intention is you see the draft statutory accounts at your next meeting. On there, we'll hand them over to Grant Thornton end of this week and publish them on our website, so they're all in the public domain. The plan is to bring the paper to you for you to pass on to them, and then they will form the final accounts. So I wasn't expecting to be a large item on the next agenda to discuss the draft accounts.
But I don't know if it's worth discussing whether we push this, if there's no one here to answer our questions, whether we would be adding any value compiling our questions if there's no one to answer them.
I agree.
I agree. I'm
happily in the hands of the committee to
no, I would agree with that statement.
To decide. Yeah, so we'll defer this item until the next meeting. Hopefully, we've got Kevin back with us.
Certainly, Chair. I know that's come back. Obviously, if members have any issues that they're aware of in the meantime, perhaps if they could email me directly to collate, and then I can forward on to the department so that we can get as many responses in advance and update the document for the next meeting.
I think that would be useful. I've certainly got nine individual points. I suspect others have got queries as well, so we'll do that.
Chair, just to be helpful to Kevin, if you could indicate to Ben if is there anything you would like the actual officer or representative from that department to be in attendance in the meeting next time as well, that may help. So I suspect Kevin, whilst he's good, probably doesn't know everything at his fingertips, so it may help if you would indicate there were specifics you wanted some different service to attend, then we can arrange for them to be here as well.
Yeah, well, what I'd when are we looking at having our pre-meeting for the next agenda? I'm just wondering if we can undertake to come forward as requests by that meeting.
Oh, so
yeah, thank you.
I think we've got the 18th.
Yeah,
it's a pre-meeting.
Catch the bottle. Yeah.
No, just checking. Earlier on the screen we had members.
Right.
Have we got anybody?
No, we haven't got anybody from Scotland.
Okay, so there's nobody sort of hanging on the line. Okay, I just wanted to check.
And so we come to agenda item 9, the anti-fraud, bribery and corruption policy. Is Jonathan on?
Yes.
Yes. Right.
Good afternoon, Chair.
Good afternoon, Jonathan. Welcome. Just to remind everybody for the committee to review and approve the updated anti-fraud, bribery and corruption policy attached to Appendix A and consider the recommendations for improvements. Jonathan, if you want to introduce your policy. I recognise that it's a significant rewrite from the previous policy, but you might want to bring to our attention any specific areas that you think worthy.
Yes, certainly. Good afternoon, committee. Yeah, so the previous anti-fraud, bribery and corruption policy was out of date. So what I've done is I've brought it to line with the counter-fraud and corruption strategy that was approved last year. So the purpose of it is to provide a clear framework alongside that strategy, which is more of a public-facing document, to give you a bit of a guidance for more of a procedural viewpoint in terms of how we manage the risk of fraud. So in terms of what's been changed, as you mentioned, it's been quite a significant amount that's been rewritten. The part which has been mainly added, which you might want to take reference to, is reference to tax evasion on page 150 of your report, which basically outlines the corporate criminal offences and what we need to have in place to prevent us being subject to corporate criminal offences as an organisation. So in that particular area, we mention reasonable preventative procedures, and it's outlined as what we need in place as an organisation to protect ourselves really from that new bit of legislation which came into act in 2017. So that's been added into the fraud policy. Again, the policy references updated information on how to report fraud, and also references the fraud response plan at the end as well, which is also outlined in the strategy. So I'm going to take the report as read, if that's okay, Chair, and take this opportunity to invite any discussion and questions at this point.
Thank you. Yes, I found it quite a straightforward report to read. Thank you for using standard straightforward English within it. Just one point, I've only got one question to ask. 11.7, which is I think on page 151, we're talking, you talk about reasonable due diligence being exercised when processing all transactions, particularly high value, high risk area payments. And I'm just wondering, how do we define that? How do we define high value, high risk area payments? Because it's in the policy, but there's no real definition of what they are.
So a bit more clarity on high value, high risk area payments. So, I mean, it could be areas which we deem high risk to tax evasion, fraud in the fraud risk assessment. So I could potentially provide a bit more information in the policy if that's what you think is needed, as to what is high value and high risk. Is it a specific examples?
I think we're the whole document really is here to give confidence to the council, that assurance to the council that we've got the policy. I'm also looking at having assurance that all officers would recognise what is a high risk, high value area payment, because without any for instances or EGs or it's down to each officer to make their own. Is it down to each officer to make their own decision about whether something is a high risk, high value area payment, and therefore they'd be taking reasonable due diligence normally, but particularly when they're high value, high risk area payments. I'm not quite understanding. It's just a very vague level of assurance to my mind. We're not. If we said particular high value, high risk area payments within housing allowance, within I don't know, section 106, whatever. I think you're probably in a position to be aware of what's a high risk area and what's a high value. And what's a high value in terms of, you know, is £1,000 a high value, or is it £1 million, or where do we draw the line? It's just putting some the very, very thin bones of what's high value, high risk to me. I mean, maybe the other member of the committee says that's perfectly fine. We all understand what that means, but I'm just conscious that it's a bit vague.
Yeah, I realise what you're saying, Chair, with being vague, but how do you quantify it? Because it's
well, that's the thing where we're asking, how do we quantify it?
That's the key.
Yeah.
You know,
what are the criteria for high value, high risk?
Yeah, each department, it's a difficult one to put a figure on, and that's why I suppose Mr. Nelson is wording it the way it's being worded.
I'm sure he's that way.
I would not know. I think where you're coming from, and it's a valid question.
Perhaps if we could have some, for instances, or EGs there.
Yeah, certainly. I think
just take a note for the next, We review this once every 3 years?
Yeah, yes, every 3 years, I believe. I think just to answer that, I think an example would be for procurement. If you were looking at value over 25,000, it would be a different threshold. So you would look at that as a different, depending on the service area, there's going to be different thresholds. So I think it's not going to be a one size fits all in terms of what the high value for that particular service area is considered. So
I think you're right, but it's not that's not clear. So what's high value in terms of housing benefit or council tax reduction or a procurement process will be very, very different. But again, the potential for high risk in those different areas is also very different, I suspect, or for grant payments or any of these things. I suspect the high value for grant payments for some of the COVID payments were very different for different grant applications. But just to have some measure, or even such that you could put in the policy possibly that any or confirmation in these areas should be sought from finance team or something to that line, if that's relevant. Again, I'm not sure how much in terms of fraud, in terms of this section comes under tax evasion. We're really anticipating in this area. Andrew, sorry.
Well, Chair, I was going to suggest that this is the policy. That clearly sitting behind this will be a load of procedural notes for staff. So I think what you're describing is a challenge for us to have that clarity in our procedure notes. I think we will receive that loud and clear, and we'll make sure that we provide that clarity to in fact frontline officers, because they're the ones having to make these judgments.
I'm conscious that it puts a responsibility on the frontline officer to easily make a bad judgment and be castigated for it, but it's not really his fault because he or she didn't have the information from the policy. If we could take that action to ask you to do that in the backup. Councillor Jim.
Just suggesting a way through your dilemma that actually in the council, drop the word reasonable, due diligence is exercised when processing all transactions. I don't think it matters whether they're high value or not. I think it becomes questionable that you actually have to have a higher level of due diligence when in fact you should have due diligence from everything, from the smallest to the largest. And actually grading it, I think, is really questionable. So I would simply say, in the council, due diligence is exercised when processing all transactions.
I think that's a way to encompass that. Jonathan, are you happy with that?
Yes, certainly. I'll definitely review it and come back to you, I think, on a revised rewording of that, if that's okay, Chair.
That's fine. Thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to talk about the section 6 on training and awareness. In terms of council recognising the importance. Yes, it supports the concept of ongoing training for all council employees, being required to complete mandatory anti-fraud awareness training. Whereas you're just talking here about council employees, whereas in 5.2 on page 148, just above it, you're talking about the wider aspect of everybody being in a position to play an important role in our culture. And I'm just reflecting on the fact that members have actually done some training now over the last couple of years on anti-fraud and bribery, corruption. So I'm just wondering where it just says in 6.1 that all council employees therefore required to complete mandatory training, whether or not it should also be reflecting the fact that members are undergoing or have been undergoing at least a level of training in this, and whether that should be widened to include members.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. Councillor Bartlett, are you making that as a recommendation from the committee, or I'm conscious though that members have received training, but it's not on an annual basis, and I don't believe it's mandatory at the moment.
Yeah, I think it would be useful to tie down whether it's just a briefing that we get on an ad hoc basis, or whether it's actually going to be part of potentially the induction process, or at some point going to be an updated piece of training in its own right.
I suppose each member of the committee would have their own view on this. My own being that it's a valuable part of our briefing, but I hesitate to add to the already not insignificant burden of mandatory training, which every councillor has to go through. I'd question whether or not individual members, I'd certainly recommend that individual members be aware of the policy and the company and counter fraud and corruption strategy, but whether they need to undertake statutory mandatory annual fraud awareness training, I'm not convinced of that where I'm sitting now. Jonathan, have you got any comment on that?
Yeah, the mandatory training is in reference to the e-learning that I developed last year, and that's on the e-learning quota for all staff and Hopel employees as well. So that's kind of where we reach out at a basic level of fraud awareness training. But then again on top of that, I provide bespoke training, which is more of a virtual session or workshop, which I provide to members as well, and that's very much on a need or demand basis, or whether there's a high risk area that's identified where we've identified that training needs to be provided on top of the mandatory e-learning. So I'm quite happy to widen the scope of what's in section 6.1. Whether you did require access to some sort of manual and annual training, I'll leave for you to make a decision. Come back to me, I think, Chair.
Could I ask? Well, Alice is about to speak. Actually, I think.
The types of decisions that would give rise to fraud risk are those decisions that are signed by officers. Therefore, I think it is mandatory for officers to go through that. I take on board Councillor Bart's point, you should have an awareness, but apologies to my computer's not going fast enough. It isn't part of your mandatory training, the best of my, would you want it to be?
Chair, I think we do have a separate group that looks at member training.
Yeah.
So I would be recommending that this perhaps gets referred to them to consider.
Yeah, I think that's the best thing we can do. Yeah. Let's take an action to do that.
Sure. It's interesting that the policy applies to members of the public. So it's pretty wide in how this policy applies in 3.1. So, I didn't know the council had taken the responsibility of the public quite so hard in that regard. I mean, I can see that the council can set a policy with regard to its employees, its elected members, etc. it did strike me that when we took on the responsibility of members of the public as well, that was quite a degree of education. So that should be on the committee that Councillor Bolton is seeking to refer it to.
Right.
Councillor Bolton.
Yeah, I think I had a more general question about the target audience for this policy, because I think we do have a number of policies that sit on our website that are public facing, and then we have a number of policies that aren't and sit on our intranet. And so I just had a question: is where does this policy sit? Should it be on the website? And then if so, there are a number of links in the back of this document with reference to internal documents. So I guess that was some guidance that I was seeking initially, in terms of because there are, as both Councillor Chimman and Councillor Bartlett have indicated, there are paragraphs in this policy that indicate that there's a greater role to play by other members other than just employees. So it's just trying to get clarity on that point, and then that would be helpful.
Jonathan, do you want to reply to that? I'm looking at 16.1 supporting policies and things like EML compromised card procedure. And I can't imagine a member of the public would want to be interested in that, or we'd want them to be looking at it. But where does this policy sit? Does it sit on the intranet, or is it external facing? Is it accessible through our website?
So thank you, Councillor Watson. I think with some of these policies, some of them are internally based, some of them are externally based. So there is a mixture on there, and I think you made reference to one which is an internally based procedure, EML compromise card procedure. So that is in reference to our PFS cards that we use. So that can be.
Explain PFS for us.
So that's the prepaid financial services cards, the cards which are widely used across, say, adult social care services and stuff like that for direct payments and a variety of other use cases. So that procedure there is what was put in place with the supplier that's actually providing that service, to ensure that they're providing good procedure with regards to fraud prevention and detection. So I think you make a valid point as to whether we should reference all of these in terms of, because this is a public facing document. The idea is that it's applicable to both internal and external, so staff, members of the public. The idea is that with regards to it being a public facing document, fraud affects organisations like public authorities on a wide scale. So what we're trying to achieve is the audience here is anyone that basically has contact with the local authority. So fraud obviously can be committed against a local authority from an external way and an internal way. So that's why it applies to both. Reference to your question earlier as well about where it would sit. We are currently developing an external web page to sit on the council web page for fraud, so that it would be easily accessible to the public via that domain as well. Hopefully that answers some of your questions.
Thank you. And I do note in rereading that you do note that some of the documents may only be accessible to internally employed staff. So in a way we cover off that they're not all accessible to external staff.
Just a question on that. Does the fraud response plan appear on the public domain? Or would it be in the same category? Sorry, would it be in that category?
So, so that's available publicly as well, and that's also in the counter fraud and corruption strategy that we publish. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bolton.
Also, just to, I've got a couple of questions, but in terms of when you're doing your website, I initially went to the policy section on the public facing on our internet, And I couldn't find anything on fraud, either the fraud. I don't think I could find fraud strategy. Admittedly, I only went under F. I didn't look under any of the other letters, but if you do update your website, if we can make sure that the link is in the policy section as well, that would be very helpful, because that's where I normally go if I'm looking for policy. Following on from Councillor Bartlett's question there around training on page 148, section 6, I was just interested, we've essentially noted a control that employees had completed mandatory training, but just conscious in the Q4 budget and performance report that came to Cabinet, I think back in May, we reported a 49% completion of mandatory training. So I just wanted to understand whether you have any figures on how many employees have completed their mandatory training in this area.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I could definitely come back to the committee with those figures and seek that from the training department.
Thank you.
But unfortunately, I don't have that to hand today, so I do apologise on that front.
Just in case it assists, all staff are required to complete all of their mandatory training. But this year we have been given an additional 2 months to do it. So although the figures might be low at the moment, I'll get chased if I haven't done it by the end of August, as I suspect everybody else will.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Councillor Bolton. If we've got no other questions.
Sorry,
Councillor Bolton again.
Sorry, Chair. I just have one more question in relation to the plan. Just go to it in the flow chart. On the fraud response plan, which is on page 157. Just in terms, this is great trying to and looking at how it was reported last time. I think you've made some great changes to it. Under phase 4, the green boxes, you've got feedback to management, and in the previous version of the policy, it referred to feedback to referrer, because if this is open, if this document is open to is valid for more than just the employee, should there be feedback to other people other than just management?
Yes, thank you. I think it's difficult to answer that, because sometimes what we try to encourage is anonymous referrals as well. So sometimes we're not necessarily given that information to hand at the time of the referral. So sometimes it could be an option to kind of feed that loop back if we do have that information to hand, especially if it's from an external organisation that's made that referral. But yeah, if it's an individual anonymous referral, then I'd be reluctant to add that into the response plan for that reason.
Okay, and then my other question was, you've got a new box on share intelligence. And I must have missed, excuse me if I've missed it, because that was quite a lot of papers to review for today, but do you refer to sharing intelligence anywhere in your policy?
And that's probably a good point raised. I could definitely add a section here to how much we collaborate, because that is something that we do on a regular basis as part of our process to share intelligence with other external organisations. That very much forms the basis of a successful investigation and the prevention that we undertake. So it's underlined more so in the strategy than it is in the policy. So I wouldn't know whether you wanted me to reference that again in the policy, whether that's covered off enough in the strategy.
I guess if this plan is found in both the strategy and the policy, then I guess it may be adequate just to refer it to the strategy. But if it's only sitting in within the policy, then I think there perhaps needs to be some explanation of what that box is, because all the other elements have already been probably described in the policy. So I'll leave that to you to make a decision.
Just to add to that, I think, Jonathan, the intention to share our learning or our
results of any investigations with others should in fact be part of our policy. It should be included within the policy as well as the strategy. The strategy is sort of how we share, or who we might share it with, I suppose. But the fact that we will be sharing, or our policy is to share, I think should be part of the policy because it's integral to where we're going. So perhaps a little section, paragraph on that would be useful.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm happy to add a section on intelligence sharing and collaboration as well. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Councillor Jindal.
Just on the flow diagram, you have a sort of leap from management decision to prosecution. I mean, fraud is only really going to be determined when there is a prosecution. At the end of the day, it's a criminal offence, isn't it? So I'm presuming that somewhere in there, management decision is referred to CPS or whoever. And then I'd also say that in your last bit, where you've got finish, you've got consider lessons learned, and you've taken it as a no from a successful outcome. Actually, lessons learned come from both success and failure. And I think that box should cover both.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Jim. I'm happy to make some amendments to the flow chart to reflect that. I think it's with management decision, it's kind of a summarisation of that process really. So that when an investigation is undertaken and it comes to that management decision in terms of what course of action will be undertaken, there is a number of different actions that could be undertaken depending on the proportionality and legality of the offence that's identified. So whether it's just recovery of losses or prosecution or whether that's in line with disciplinary hearing, if it was an internal investigation as well. So is it that you feel like there needs to be a bit more information around phase 3 to kind of justify?
Yeah, I just think phase 3, you've been very correct up to there where you put fraud question mark, because at that stage, it's the belief there may well have been fraud, but until such time as there's been due process, it's not proven that it's actually happened. So actually, it would follow prosecution and recovery of losses and so on would flow from it. So I think it just, I don't envy you drawing this up, I might add. Every time anybody does a flow diagram, everybody has ideas on it. But I just think that for correctness and as it's going into the public view, that it needs to make sure that we're not becoming judge and jury of what fraud is. There is still a due process that has to be followed.
Perhaps if I can suggest, instead of fraud question mark, it says fraud suspected.
Yeah, I think that's the point I'm trying to get across.
That goes on to a management decision about what you deal with a suspicion of fraud.
Yeah. Okay, so so with sorry, just to add to that, and so where it says phase 3 fraud question mark, this is kind of the terminology that we're using in that particular box.
So we're not saying from that box, yes,
it's that box and what flows from it, because you've got council legal department, dotted line sort of in there, which seems to me to be absolutely right, that the management decision would be informed by the legal opinion and the likelihood then of it going forward for a prosecution or recovery of losses, or is it merely a disciplinary hearing? There are different routes that might take depending upon the seriousness of the event. So I can understand what you're trying to say there, but I just think we want to be careful as to how it's put, that we're not acting as judge and jury in terms of prosecution. That is something that would be external, dealt with by CPS or equivalent anyway. We could perhaps something just talk through with the legal department so that it looks right. I've got a grimace from across the way which says thank you very much for that hospital pass.
Thank you. Any other comments? If not, then we've got 2 recommendations. I don't know, we've got some some actions as well that we've collated?
Yes, I mean, obviously you've identified a couple of points, suggesting revised wording around 11.7 and also those matters you're discussing in terms of the section on intelligent sharing and collaboration. You added the flow chart to make reference to lessons learned, successful outcomes, and also terminology on that issue around involved phase 3. In terms of actions, we've got, I think you wanted the Member Development Working Group be invited to consider most appropriate means to raise council awareness around the policy, whether that be training or some other form. But that to be referenced to the Development Working Group. Find a link once published on the council website, so all members are aware of where that sits on the website, and also the figures on completion of mandatory training once the deadline has passed.
Thank you. And the recommendations, I'll read out A and B. The updated anti-fraud, bribery and corruption policy attached be reviewed, which we've done, and the committee determined the recommendations makes to ensure its effectiveness. No additional recommendations, but some actions. That the updated anti-fraud, bribery and corruption policy is approved by the committee and recommended for adoption by the Cabinet Member for Finance. Are we all content? Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan, for your work in that. There's not a
lot of work in it.
Yeah,
no, good piece of work.
Good piece of paper.
It's done a lot of work.
So, agenda item 10, the work programme update. Those of you with extremely strong glasses, you'll be able to read this off your computer screens. Otherwise, I'll slight benefit over the ones I've got a printed version of this.
This is the proposal made for the
In fact, I've got a printed version. So, looking at the next meeting in July, we've got internal audit opinion, the financial procedure and contract rules updates. Are there any of those coming forward, Andrew? Do we know?
There's just a few minor refreshers on both of them.
Right, thank you. Ongoing work statement. We've intention to review will be the draft statement of accounts.
Yes.
How that stage went it. View of the effectiveness of council governance process, system and control. The annual government statement that's been moved to September. So I couldn't understand the implementation. That's it, pretty much. But of course, we'll have today's agenda item on the internal audit with recommendations to come forward as well. So I think enough for a meeting. Any comments? Any questions? In which case, it just remains for me to say thank you to all of you for attending. Thank you to the officers and those attending on Zoom. The date of the next meeting will be Monday, the 25th of July at 11 AM. Can I ask that the live